Hello, Alex here, and in this video I want to talk about the Mark I version of Canon's EF 300mm f2.8 L IS USM supertelephoto lens. Full disclaimer before we really get into this, I'm not the kind of wildlife photographer who waits and hides for hours. I'm more of a walk around and find urban birds to small to medium-sized animals like deer and dogs kind of wildlife shooter. I don't go on safari or anything like that. If that's the kind of video you're looking for, it's fine, don't watch this one, I won't hold it against you. But if you are interested in what I have to say, let's get into it. First released back in 1999, the Canon EF 300mm f2.8 L IS USM telephoto lens is one of your archetypal lenses. A 300mm f2.8 is kind of a staple in most lens lineups, along with a 400 2.8, a 500 f4, and a 600 f4. They're like the holy quadrilogy of your super telephoto lenses. 300mm is realistically at the bottom of the super telephoto / telephoto divide, but given that it's in the same build class and general quality range as those other lenses, I consider it fair to call it a super telephoto lens in context. This is one of your classic lenses for either sports or wildlife photography. The classic sports lens is usually a 400mm f2.8, where this is either for smaller fields or generally a more affordable substitute, or for wildlife photography, it's generally more suitable for larger animals or shooting at shorter distances. Another popular use for a lens like this that has really kind of ramped up in the last couple of years, based on what I've seen on forums and YouTube, is using a 300mm lens for portraiture, getting extreme compression of your subject's features, which can lead to a certain look that a lot of people find appealing. Being a white-bodied telephoto lens in Canon's lineup, it goes a step beyond even the normal L lenses, and it has extremely high build quality and weather resistance. As a result, it's big and heavy, at about 260mm long and 130mm wide without the hood, or about 415mm long and about 145mm wide with the hood attached, and about 2.6 kilos naked or 2.9, nearly 3 kilos fully loaded. It's a very big and heavy lens compared to a normal consumer lens. Obviously a 600mm f4 or an 800mm f5.6 is massive by comparison. But even though I can hold this in one hand relatively easily for a short period, it's the kind of lens that you attach the camera to rather than attaching to the camera. It's in a different class to what the normal consumer lenses kind of live in. As this is an EF mount lens, it's compatible with everything from the EOS 650 up to the R3. It can be mounted to any EF or EFS mount camera natively, or any EFM or RF mount camera with the appropriate adapter, and there are no compatibility issues, it just works. This is a prime lens, meaning it does not zoom, and it has a fixed focal length of 300mm. The optical construction consists of 17 elements in 13 groups, including one fluorite element and 2 ultra-low dispersion or UD elements. The lens has a maximum aperture of f2.8, stopping down to a minimum at f32, and though there is no aperture ring, as is typical for this class of lenses, you can control it either in half or third stops depending on your camera. The aperture itself consists of 8 rounded blades, yielding nice, smooth out-of-focus highlights. As expected from a lens in this class, it is fully compatible with any of Canon's EF mount extenders, which are their name for teleconverters. The 1.4, 1.7 or 2x extenders all work with this camera with a corresponding reduction in aperture. The lens does not have a front filter thread for that gigantic front element, so instead it has a rear mount gelatin filter holder. There is a clear filter installed by default, and this is part of the optical construction and should not be removed. The lens does not use a standardized hood due to its massive size, and instead uses this thumb screw locking bayonet mount hood, which has a rubberized front ring so that you can just put the thing down standing up. Say if you're swapping the body, like I said, or if you just want to not have the body or barrel of your lens or the body of your camera, say scratching rocks or in the sand or whatever, it's easier just to put this thing down with that rubberized ring standing up. Like every other lens in this class, the lens cap itself isn't a normal pinchy cap like you would be used to with a 35mm lens or a 70-200 or something like that. It is a large leather cap that sits over the reversed lens hood, and it has a little handle on the front so that you can pull it off really quickly. Say if you have the thing mounted on a tripod, you're waiting in a hide, maybe not on a hide, or like at a sports event at an interval. You can leave everything set up, pop the lens hood on, and then just quickly rip it off without worrying about pinching the thing if you have gloves on or whatever. In terms of dexterity, it's a huge advantage to have a cap like this, and it works really well. Sometimes f2.8 isn't enough, so the lens does have an image stabilization or IS module built in, and it's a pretty smart one. It has tripod sensing, so if you have the camera mounted to a tripod, a monopod, or say a gimbal head, you can leave the image stabilization enabled and it will automatically compensate just the correct amount to compensate for mirror slap or shutter shock. It's from an era where you don't get the full suite of X number of stops like we do with modern lenses. However, I can shoot this lens at about 1/250th handheld without IS, obviously for static subjects, and about 1/50th to 1/40th-ish, depending on how caffeinated I am when I'm shooting with the image stabilization enabled. The lens has a large number of weather sealing gaskets throughout its construction, the most obvious which is at the lens mount, though mine does have a slight little rip in it. I've had no problems with it. This lens is designed to survive extreme tough conditions, you know, the kind of conditions where you would worry about your 24-70 maybe being questionable. This is the kind of lens that does not care about that kind of weather condition. The focus motor is an older USM or ultrasonic motor, and honestly, it's not a problem. It can focus down from infinity to 2.5 meters, which I think gives a magnification of 0.13x or a reproduction ratio of about 1:7.5, 7.6. I'll put the numbers on screen up there. So it doesn't focus super close, but if you're shooting wildlife, it's hard to get that close to animals anyway, and if you're shooting very small animals where you're struggling to fill the frame at that distance, you just need a longer focal length. If you're shooting sports, I can see that being more of a problem. This is rectified in the modern Mark II version of the lens, which has a much reduced, I believe 1.5 or 1.6 meter minimum focusing distance, which makes a huge difference. Regardless, this lens on its own merit performs extremely well. Focusing is incredibly fast and I have zero issues with it whatsoever. I've been able to track small birds like terns flying straight at me with the 1DX Mark III through the optical viewfinder, not even using dual pixel autofocus in live view, and up until about 3 to 4 meters, there's no problem even with the bird flying towards me at full speed. When it comes to transporting the lens, there are two kind of strap lugs on the side of the barrel. I have Peak Design anchors attached to these, so I can just use my normal Peak Design straps without having to worry about putting stress on the camera mount. There's also a tripod kind of collar around the back of the lens, and it's supposed to come off, but mine doesn't. Aside from that, it is not Arca Swiss compatible, which was the norm for the age, but may be a problem for you now if you have to buy a plate or possibly try and find a third-party collar. You might just have to slap an Arca Swiss plate on the bottom of the existing tripod foot and live with that. Mine is currently in the attic buried under you don't want to know how much stuff, but the lens does also have a hard flight case which can be used for transporting it aside from when it's in your backpack or whatever for international travel in particular. It's extremely sturdy, everything fits extremely snugly, and there's a pretty simple lock just to make sure things stay secure. But it is pretty heavily emblazoned with the Canon logo, which might attract thieves in the airport if that's something you're concerned about when you're traveling. The left-hand side of the barrel includes your normal autofocus, manual focus, and image stabilization controls, though there are a few more options than what you're typically used to with a consumer lens. The focusing ring is extremely large and wonderfully smooth to use. It turns from infinity down to 2.5 meters in about 190 to 200 degrees, a little over half a turn. So it may be a bit much to try and do in one shimmy of your hands while you're hand holding the lens, but realistically it's not a problem for making relatively coarse or somewhat fine adjustments, just not going from infinity to minimum focus or back and forth. Lastly, right at the front of the lens, there are 4 black buttons at 90-degree increments around the front of this rubberized ring. I don't actually know for sure what they do. I think you can use them to engage AF on or AF stop, AE lock, or various customizable functions, but I've never used them, so I'm going to check and put that information over here. The maximum aperture of f2.8 is fantastic for either low light shooting or for separating your subject from your background. Like I said, for sports, a 400mm f2.8 is your kind of go-to gold standard, but this lens usually costs a quarter to a sixth as much. And it's nearly as long, so with a little bit of cropping, especially on a modern higher resolution sensor, you can probably get away with it, and it'll work almost as well most of the time. As I have alluded to not so subtly, the build quality of these lenses is absolutely fantastic, and it would be very hard to actually break one. Mine has seen quite a bit of abuse over the years, with lots of paint chipped off, and there are a few scratches and dings that weren't there when I got it, and it just keeps going. It doesn't care. These lenses are built to last, and realistically, they're the kind of lens where your camera is more likely to break than the lens if you were to drop the thing. It's the kind of thing that will happily rip the lens mount out of your camera if you drop it. Resolution, at least in the 20 to 30 megapixel range, is absolutely fantastic. Take a look at this picture of a heron that I shot a while ago. Even wide open at f2.8, and this is a 7-ish megapixel crop from the 20 megapixel 1DX Mark III. It's still a very sharp shot, and I've applied no sharpening. It's just fantastic. It is a little bit softer in the corners, and it does improve stopping down, say, even just f4, but it's never a bad lens. There is no situation in which it performs poorly. General optical quality is also just fantastic. There's a tiny trace of vignetting wide open at like very far distances when shooting into the sky. I said it does stop down a little, sharpen up a little bit better when you stop down by about a stop. There are no problems with chromatic aberration. There's no real detectable distortion in real world shooting, those kind of things. It's absolutely fantastic. Although a heavy lens, it is generally quite well balanced, at least with a reasonably substantial body mounted to the back of it. I've carried it on a monopod, I've carried it by hand by the tripod foot, and I've had it mounted to a tripod. And it's not really that front heavy. It does balance quite well despite its weight, but if you had a lighter camera, like say an R7 attached to the rear of it, it might be a bit of an issue and you might need to look into a gimbal head that you can properly balance in a case like that. I'm not going to repeat everything I said because I already said a little bit too much when I brought it up earlier, but the autofocus performance is absolutely fantastic. I'm sure the Mark II version of the lens is a little bit better in that regard, but this lens is by no means a poor performer. Having such a wide range of controls on the lens itself means you're spending more time actually shooting, and you can assign these in different ways that you can use your hands and fingers quite independently without having to dive into menus and distract yourself from what is actually going on. I'm not at the level where that matters, and I'm willing to admit that, but for the kind of person who is in that kind of ultra time critical scenario, being able to do things like engage autofocus stop, or AE lock, or snap to a preset focus distance like say a goal on a sports field, that is a huge advantage that a lot of consumer lenses just do not have. And even within this lineup, even though this is the baby of the super telephoto range, it's nice that all these things are included. As I've mentioned in my older review of the Canon EF 50mm f1.2, a lot of these older lenses have an aperture mechanism that cannot open and close fast enough to kind of keep up with modern high-speed shooting, where you need to close the aperture to take the picture, reopen, readjust focus, and then shut down again. And the actual actuation speed of those aperture blades just can't hold up with more modern high-speed systems. The 1DX Mark III can shoot at 16 frames per second through the optical viewfinder, and even at f5.6, I'm maintaining 13 frames per second with this lens. So I'm not stopping it down to f11 because I don't use this lens at f11. But even at something like f5.6, 2 stops down from the max aperture, you're seeing a negligible reduction in your maximum shooting speed. So that is worthy of praise, and it shows just the kind of technology that was put into this lens, probably the guts of 25 years ago when they started designing it for release 23 years ago. And that it's able to still hold up today, that's very impressive, and it's not a hindrance for modern high-speed shooting. Although the minimum focusing distance of 2.5 meters realistically isn't a problem for most wildlife situations, because if you're shooting very large animals, they're going to fill the frame pretty easily, and if you're shooting very small animals like tiny birds, you probably should be using a longer focal length anyway. But for sports, say, maybe indoors like a basketball court where you're quite cramped for space, not like a football field where you have a lot more room to step back around the sidelines, that 2.5 meters might become a bit of a problem. It's definitely significantly better on the Mark II version of the lens, but for a lot of people, I don't think it's going to matter, although it is certainly quite a poor performance relative to the more modern super telephoto lenses from the kind of major manufacturers that we have today. Unlike something like a 50mm prime that you can recommend to just about everybody regardless of film format, from GFX with the 50mm f3.5 where it's a kind of wide standard lens, to your APS-C cameras where a 50mm gives the field of view that makes them nice for quite portraiture kind of applications. With this kind of telephoto, super telephoto range, you kind of need to know in advance if the focal length is something that you're going to like and that will work for you. I was happy to buy this lens because I've shot 3,000, maybe 4,000 frames with my old Nikon AFS 300mm f4. So even though that's a much smaller, lighter lens, I knew that the 300mm focal length worked well for the kind of shooting that I do most of the time. For you, it's a lot of money to invest if you're not sure that it's a focal length you want. For that reason, it might be worth renting a zoom and trying it out at different focal lengths to see how you get on before you commit to any specific focal length. Just walk around shooting, say, a 150-600 or a 100-400 at 200mm, at 300, etc. and see how you get on. See what works for you and use that to inform your decisions. That's just one of the disadvantages of going for a prime lens, but there are obviously a lot of advantages of working with these within this kind of genre of photography. Lastly, again, it's big, which isn't the end of the world, but it's heavy. You're talking 4+ kilos when mounted to a substantial camera like this one. Realistically, minimum 3.5 kilos for any setup. And that isn't the heaviest thing in the world, but when it's hanging on your back or over your shoulder for a long day's shooting, it really bogs you down, and it's another huge advantage of the Mark II version of the lens, which is significantly lighter. So this has been my review of the Canon EF 300mm f2.8 L IS USM super telephoto lens. This thing has been an absolute blast to use. It's probably one of my favorite lenses I've ever used in my life, and I've been shooting for nearly 16 years at this stage. Jesus. It's a very serious tool that fills a very specific niche. I mean, you have multiple applications for it, but it is admittedly a very niche tool. But it does what it does extraordinarily well, and it never, ever gets in your way. Even this older version of the lens has never once held me back, and everything that has gone wrong with this has been conclusively and obviously my own fault. Say like choosing the wrong autofocus settings on the 1D for the type of subject that I'm tracking. It's an absolute monster, it's big and it's heavy, and they are expensive. But it is a hell of a lot less expensive than a 400mm f2.8, a 500 f4, a 600 f4. And if you need something in the 300 to 600mm range, and you can tolerate the 2.5 meter minimum focusing distance as well as the weight, it's very much worth considering the possibility of using this lens with a teleconverter to get something that's a third of a stop to a full stop slower than those bigger primes in a much more compact package with 95% of the optical performance, at least if you use the Mark III teleconverters. For most people, this isn't a lens you should even be considering, but for someone who's either willing to compromise on the peak quality for a more compact package, as I said, or someone who just wants to kind of dip their toes into this kind of realm of photography, like I was getting my first f2.8 white lens, it's a very good option, especially if you can get it for the right price. Again, we're talking low 4 figures versus low to mid 5 figures. It's very hard to argue those lenses for a consumer. This is kind of a realistic lens for a consumer or hobbyist compared to those other bigger lenses. For the vast majority of people, especially hobbyists though, something like a zoom is probably a lot better of an option. Say the Canon EF 100-400mm Mark II, or the Sigma or Tamron 150-600mm lenses, which give you significantly expanded flexibility and range, 100-400, 150-600, but at the cost of a reduced maximum aperture. And with the Tamron and Sigma lenses, you know, there are slight finicky bits of compatibility with certain cameras, but realistically, you can just rent it and try it out. And unless you're using an extremely niche, older system, like the 150-600s might not work on the 1V, where the official Canon lenses do. In the grand scheme of things, that's an extremely niche case, but it's one of the only things you could really say against getting one of those lenses. If you don't need f2.8, a zoom is probably the way to go. But if you need or want it, because wanting and desire is definitely a thing that happens, a lens like this will not let you down. That's all I really have to say about this lens, so stay safe, and bye bye for now. If you don't already, follow me on Instagram at Chaka1277 for new pictures every day. If you like this video and enjoy what I do on the channel, please consider subscribing or checking out my Patreon, where the tiers start at just €1 per month.